You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another Top 20 video. I was originally going to do this as a Top 10, but decided to flesh it out to 20. As you can see by the title, today we'll be counting down my top 20 RPGs of all time. RPGs are role-playing games, for those of you who may not know for some reason. Now, one of the things that made this video kind of tough to make was determining what exactly constitutes an RPG, because there's many elements that go into making games RPGs, and not all RPGs are alike. So I've done my best to determine what is and isn't an RPG, and I recently had a poll on my channel about whether or not Telltale Games were RPGs. This is the video that's relevant to. So essentially, when I asked that, the response was 29% yes, 29% no, and then 42% kind of. So, kinda wins, so in that case, I have a plan of what I plan to do with it. That said, for this video, there is one other rule besides determining whether something actually is an RPG, and the other rule is only one entry per franchise. And since you already know Telltale Games are going to somehow be involved in this video, I'm going to say that I'm counting Telltale itself as a franchise, even though it's multiple different series. But all of their games play effectively the same. I also saw a bunch of lists that put games as RPGs that I absolutely would not. Like, a lot of lists consider Minecraft an RPG. And I do admit in later updates it did add a bunch of RPG-type elements, but I still would never consider Minecraft an RPG. I even saw some list that put Halo 2 on it for some reason, and I'm like, what the fuck are you on about? Halo 2 is absolutely not an RPG. But anyway, let's start off the list with number 20. So at number 20, here's one that you should be expecting, is Telltale Games. I'm just putting Telltale Games as one entry. My favorite Telltale game is The Wolf Among Us, but I do also quite like Game of Thrones, The Walking Dead first 2 seasons, Tales from the Borderlands, and the Batman one. So I do like a good amount of Telltale games. Wolf Among Us is my favorite. The only reason this is so low on the list, the reason it's at number 20, is because people said it's only kind of an RPG, and I'm kind of inclined to agree, because it's not really an RPG, but since a large part of RPG is based on the element of choice, I kind of felt that it sort of is, because you are playing a role in that you're making the choices, even if Telltale is notorious for having, in some regards, the illusion of choice. Telltale games are primarily interactive stories, where you just kind of walk from place to place, have a few quick time events, and then make choices with dialogue. It's really more of a genre in and of itself, and that's the only reason it's not higher up on the list, is because I can't really call it a traditional RPG in many regards. If I were placing Telltale based on how much I like the games, specifically The Wolf Among Us, Game of Thrones, and Tales from the Borderlands, the franchise, as I'm calling it, would be more like number 6 rather than number 20. But again, since it's not really RPGs, and they're only sort of kind of RPGs, we're putting them here at number 20, but I do like them quite a bit. And so I do feel like they did deserve a spot on this list. Alright, number 19, The Legend of Zelda. I would say my favorite Zelda game is Ocarina of Time. I do also like Majora's Mask, but I'm not very good at it. Zelda is another one I put lower just because I don't know if it's really an RPG. It definitely has RPG elements. The Legend of Zelda absolutely has RPG elements, so I would say at least in some regard it is an RPG. But typically when I think of Zelda, I think more of action-adventure games rather than RPG. But it's got inventories, it's got a level system, you name your character. So I do think to an extent the Zelda series is an RPG franchise. I will say I do feel like there's more RPG elements in some of the older ones, but I haven't played like Breath of the Wild or anything like that. Ocarina of Time I feel like has less RPG elements than, say, especially Zelda 2. Zelda 2 is the one that feels the most like an RPG, I think. If I were to rank it based on how much I like Zelda, again, it would probably be a little bit higher. I can't say exactly where, because I'm not like a super big Zelda fanboy, but I do like the Legend of Zelda quite a bit, especially Ocarina of Time. So with that, I do feel like it deserved to be on the list, because Zelda does, in many regards, have RPG elements. It is kind of an RPG. So Zelda's a fun game. Ocarina of Time is my favorite, but I do like a few of the others as well. So there it is. Alright, now we're moving on to number 18, which is Kingdom Hearts. Story-wise, I prefer Kingdom Hearts 1, but gameplay-wise, I prefer Kingdom Hearts 2. I've never beaten a single Kingdom Hearts game, although I have seen the ending to both of them, because I've seen them be beaten by people I knew, because I was in the room when my brother and my cousin were beating them at different times. Kingdom Hearts is a very fun game, but the story gets kind of convoluted, especially starting with 2 and then later on. But despite the really convoluted story, I do think especially 2 has really good gameplay, and I do like the ending of 1. I think that the sacrifice made at the ending of 1, if you played it, you know what I'm talking about, is something that really elevates 1 story-wise above 2 for me. But gameplay-wise, 2 has it beat hands down. Kingdom Hearts is the closest thing I've played to a Final Fantasy game. I've never actually played a Final Fantasy game, but I do like the Final Fantasy characters in Kingdom Hearts, so I do like the way they are in that game. But Kingdom Hearts 2 is a very fun game. I would say if I had to pick one to put on the list, I suppose I would probably pick Kingdom Hearts 2 because I put a lot more time into that and I had a lot more fun playing it. But Kingdom Hearts is an action RPG, and it's a very fun one at that. It mixes a bunch of Disney characters with Final Fantasy characters if you're unfamiliar, but it's quite a fun game, and I've enjoyed it quite a bit. That said, the reason it's number 18 on the list is because it's not one of my absolute favorite games of all time, and I do think the story gets kind of convoluted. Alright, number 17, we have Call of Cthulhu, the 2018 version, not to be confused with Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth. Now, this game actually is an adaptation of a tabletop RPG, so, where you have the book and possibly dice in some aspects. I don't know. If people are more familiar with it, let me know. I've never been big on tabletop, but tabletop is things like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. But Call of Cthulhu, there was a tabletop RPG, which was later adapted into this game, Call of Cthulhu, in 2018. This game's pretty fun. I've never beat it. I'm currently stuck on this level where you have to sneak around this mental asylum and try to sneak past the guards. That's kind of frustrating. I've gotten really close to beating it, but then I always get caught at the last minute and you have to do the whole thing over again. I do think I prefer Dark Corners of the Earth as a Call of Cthulhu game, but this is still a really fun one too, and this is probably my second favorite Lovecraft game. That said, I haven't played a ton of Lovecraft games, so it's only fair. Once again, similarly to Call of Cthulhu, I don't think this one is predominantly based off the Call of Cthulhu, but it does mix in a bunch of things from other Lovecraft short stories, like The Shadow over Innsmouth, and a few others. But I don't feel like doing a game based on the actual Call of Cthulhu short story would actually be very fruitful, because I just don't see it working as a game. I feel like it only really works as a short story, or possibly a movie, like that 2005 movie. But I do think that calling the game Call of Cthulhu does make sense, because that's typically what people do when they make a Lovecraft game, is try to tie it to his most recognizable property, even if it's not entirely based off of it. But as a big Lovecraft fan, it was only natural that I would enjoy this game. Alright, number 16, Paper Mario. I chose this over Super Mario RPG because I've played Paper Mario more, but I do like both of those games quite a bit. Paper Mario is a really fun RPG game, and it's where you play as Mario, naturally, and then you build up a party of different allies you meet along the way, and it's a turn-based RPG. It's a very traditional turn-based RPG for the most part, but it's set in the Mario world, and it's got a nice little aesthetic where everything is made of paper. I think I've beat it, but it was many years ago. I never actually had a physical copy of it myself, but my cousin did, and I played it at his house. And I do remember the fact that I did at least see the ending, even if I didn't beat it, but I do think I beat it, because I remember the fireworks at the ending. But yeah, I've only played the original Paper Mario. I've never played either of the sequels, but I do really like Paper Mario, and it does kind of feel like a successor to Super Mario RPG. Alright, number 15, Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Now, Dragon Ball Xenoverse is another one I had to think about whether or not it was an RPG, but it definitely is. Because you create a character, you level up, you grind for items, and there is side quests and main quests, so I definitely think it does fit the criteria of being an RPG. I feel like it fits the term RPG a lot better than Telltale especially, but also to an extent that Zelda does. Out of the Xenoverse games, I will admit I do think Xenoverse 2 is probably the genuinely better game, but I think I had more fun with Xenoverse 1. I put a lot more time into it. Because Xenoverse 1 and 2 are very much kind of the same. There's definitely some differences and improvements made in 2, which is why I do think it is the better game. But I think I just had more fun with 1 and spent more time on it. Like, it's a game where I grinded and played the shit out of for a very long time. I remember grinding a lot just to get the move Blue Hurricane, which is one of the spammiest, overpowered moves in the game, which they actually nerfed in Xenoverse 2, which is probably for the best, but it did kind of frustrate me importing it over from Xenoverse 1 to have it be nerfed, because I'm pretty sure importing it over is literally the only way you can unlock it in Xenoverse 2. But it's a fun Dragon Ball game, and it has an original story where you still do interact with parts of the actual Dragon Ball Z storyline, but it's an original story with an original character involving time travel. Which is a nice change of pace, because a lot of Dragon Ball games literally just retell the story of Z, and I was honestly getting kind of tired of that, which is part of why I really liked Xenoverse. Alright, number 14, Gantz the Game. Now, Gantz the Game is a game I've done a full playthrough of on the channel before, and I did start a second playthrough as Nishi. The problem with that is I think I lost part of the footage from my Nishi playthrough, so next time I pick up and actually do a video on it, it's going to be missing part of it, but luckily it's not a whole ton. But it is going to miss part of a level, but it's not going to miss the entire level, because I was recording part of it and then stopped, and I lost that footage. But back to the actual topic at hand, Gantz the Game is another one that's kind of a hybrid RPG, third-person shooter sort of thing. It definitely has a lot of RPG elements, and I qualify it as an RPG simply because it does have a lot of character development and dialogue trees that you have to go through. Not that I could understand any of them when I was playing the game, because it's all in Japanese, because it was never released outside of Japan. But it is a game where you level up your relationships with the different characters. You also level up your own stats, and you will get different endings depending on your interactions with the characters and whether or not you were able to keep specific characters alive or not, and how many you were able to keep alive. For instance, I got the best ending, from what I understand, where I kept everyone alive. You get different endings depending on your relationships with the different characters and who has died and who has lived. When you do a second playthrough as a different character besides Kay, you actually don't get the RPG elements, so I would say that that's less like it, other than the leveling up. But when you're playing through the actual main story mode rather than extra mode, you definitely do get role-playing elements where you're deciding what to say to specific characters and what you do in specific situations. And on top of that, like I said, there is a level system where you build your stats and choose your weapons and everything, so it's definitely an RPG, at least to some extent. And it's one of my favorite anime games. And I will admit, I think part of what elevates it is how much I like the Gantz series as a whole, so I do think that definitely does elevate it a little bit, too. Alright, number 13, we got Dark Cloud. Now, this is a game I've been playing at a friend of mine's house. I don't actually have a copy of it myself, but it's a PS2 RPG, where the world has basically been, destroyed by this, giant genie guy called the Dark Genie. But luckily, this good genie guy has saved portions of the world in these things called Atla, which you go and gather to rebuild your town and rebuild all the other towns. I'm still only on the first town, so I haven't progressed very far in the game, which is probably one of the only reasons it's not higher on the list, because I am liking it quite a bit, but I didn't feel it was fair, given how little of it I've actually played. I've only played through the first town and the first dungeons. But it's an interesting game, which has city-building mechanics, because you do rebuild the towns as you collect the Atla, but it also has procedurally generated dungeons, which is very unique for a PS2 game. You don't see that a whole lot on the PlayStation 2. But because they are procedurally generated, the items you get are very much random number generated, so they're RNG. So you get lucky sometimes, you get unlucky other times. I myself have gotten very unlucky because I've gotten pretty far in the first dungeon set and only have the original dagger. But overall, I've been having fun with it, and hopefully it just gets better from there. Again, I've only played the first town, so we'll see how it goes from there, but I've liked it so far. Alright, at number 12, we have Mass Effect 3. Now, why Mass Effect 3 rather than Mass Effect 2 or Mass Effect 1? It's quite simple. Mass Effect 3 is literally the only Mass Effect I've actually played, and I have not beat it. However, I am familiar with the ending and how kind of disappointing the ending was for a lot of people. I do know they made a DLC with a different ending, but despite that, I've liked everything I've played with Mass Effect. Mass Effect is a very unique RPG because it's also a shooter, and then it's an RPG on top of that. So it has nice character development, leveling, customization, and romance options. But it's also got a third-person shooter to it where you're actually going and doing the missions. Mass Effect was made by BioWare, and it very much feels like a spiritual successor to Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. With the way you gather your party and you have your own ship and a bunch of other aspects, it definitely feels like a Knights of the Old Republic successor, because Knights of the Old Republic also had romance options and things like that. Definitely not to the extent that Mass Effect did, because Mass Effect has straight-up sex scenes in it, but we'll get a little bit more to Knights of the Old Republic later, hint hint. Number 11, we have Phantasy Star Universe. Now, Phantasy Star Universe is the only Phantasy Star game that I have played at length. I have played a little bit of Phantasy Star 1 and 2, and I have played a little bit of Phantasy Star Online 1. I have not yet played Phantasy Star Online 2, but I have downloaded it to my console. Now, I will admit, a huge bias here in favor of this game that puts it so high on the list is nostalgia. This game is one of the most nostalgic games for me of all time. And that's simply due to the demo that was on the Xbox 360, and just how much fun I had with the social aspect of that. That said, the actual game itself is fairly decent too as an RPG. It's definitely not my favorite RPG, which is why it's still down at number 11, but it's definitely up there. I enjoy it quite a bit. I've never beat it, but I have gotten fairly far. The actual story mode, you don't create your own character. You play as the main character, Ethan Weber, but you still level him up and all that. But there is something called Extra Mode, which I actually like quite a bit, because it's more the experience you would have got with the online mode or the demo, where you create your own character and level them up and do your own natural progression that way, rather than playing as a set character. That said, Ethan Weber is okay. I think he's an alright character. The voice acting in it in English is absolutely god-awful, but if you can get past that, it's a fairly fun RPG. Alright, number 10, Legend of Dynamic Goshuden Hokai no Rando. Now that's a mouthful, but what this essentially is a Go Nagai RPG that mixes many of his different franchises together in one singular world. You play as an original character that was made for the game, who you name yourself, and you go out, and you go around encountering enemies and allies from various different Go Nagai works, and progress your way through the world. Now, I have not been able to actually understand anything any of the characters have been saying, because once again, this was exclusively released in Japan, but the fact that you can have a team of Violence Jack, Devilman, Cutie Honey, Naojiro Abashiri, Kikanosuke Abashiri, and the Getter Robo crew, and then you can later pilot Getter Robo, I think that's pretty fucking cool. Once again, it's a very fun turn-based RPG, and it's fairly standard turn-based RPG fare as far as the gameplay goes. That's definitely not a detriment to it. If you like turn-based RPGs, it's a very fun one. But I will say, again, I have not been able to understand what any of the characters are saying. That said, I've still enjoyed it quite a bit, because I've encountered, characters from Devilman, Violence Jack, Demon Prince Enma, even Omori-kun, so some of his more obscure stuff. And as a huge Go Nagai fan, I definitely think that elevates it really high on this list as well to put it in the top 10. Alright, number 9, we have Fallout 3. Now, why specifically Fallout 3? It's the one I've put the most time into and had the most fun with. That said, I have also played Fallout New Vegas and a little bit of Fallout 4. I've never beat a single Fallout game, but I have enjoyed them. I do like the atmosphere of the Fallout games, but I've never been, super hooked on them as much as I have with, say, the Elder Scrolls, which, hint, hint, we'll get to those later. But Fallout is still a fun game. If you like Elder Scrolls, it plays very similarly, but with guns and modern weapons instead of swords and bows and staffs and stuff. Fallout is also post-apocalyptic, so that's pretty cool. I do like post-apocalyptic fiction, so that's really fun. But, again, I never got, super hooked on it like I have with some of the ones that are later on in this top 10. But I do think that it definitely is worth playing, and I've had a lot of fun with it with what I have played. If I recall, I got to that one vault where you go into that virtual reality, and that one little girl is telling you to kill people, and I think that that's one of my favorite quests in the game. But I do like the world of Fallout. I find it a very interesting story lore-wise, and that's another thing that does elevate it, but the game itself is also very fun. Alright, number 8, the Deluca family. Now, this is one of my favorite games of all time. Now, the reason it is not higher on this list is because, again, it's something that is only an RPG in some aspects. I would say it's actually more of a visual novel, because it definitely feels more like that. But it is also kind of an RPG, and in some regards, I guess visual novels do kind of have some overlap with RPGs. But the Deluca family is a adults-only game that I originally played on Newgrounds and then downloaded the actual download file of it. And it was made by someone by the name of Hopes Gaming. Now, the Deluca family is a game where you're put in with this mafia family. I've done a whole review of this game in the past. And essentially you have to build up your way in this mafia family while also developing your relationships with the other members of the mafia family. It has romance aspects, obviously, because it is a porn game, technically, but I would say it's more 20% porn and 80% story. And they do make you earn those spicy scenes. You have to work for them. But on top of that, another thing that I do think makes it an RPG is there are missions that you have to do, and you do have to grind those missions to advance certain parts of the story. Now, these missions are things that auto-play themselves, that depending on the stats you grind will give you a higher success or failure rate, but they are things you need to go out of your way to do in order to progress the story naturally. Unless you're playing the Newgrounds version, which is a very dumbed-down version of the game, but still good overall. But I do think those missions are one thing that does make it more of an RPG, and actually made me decide to put it on this list. Like I said, it's one of my absolute favorite games of all time, despite the fact that it's an independently made porn game, technically. Alright, number 7, we have Fable 2. Now, I like Fable 1 and Fable 3 quite a bit too, but I haven't played as much of Fable 1, which is why I like Fable 2 better, I think, because Fable 2 is actually what I started with, and I absolutely loved it. Because a lot of people tell me Fable 1 is better, but I've never beat Fable 1, so I can't confirm or deny that. However, I have beat Fable 2 and 3, and I loved them both, especially Fable 2. Fable 3 is decent, but not as good as the first two. I can say that, even though I haven't beat Fable 1. But Fable is an action RPG, where you create your adventurer, you get different weapons, you level yourself up, there's romance aspects to it, and it's got multiple endings depending on the choice you make at the end. I think it's a very fun game and a good classic story of revenge as well. It's a very fun fantasy game, so if you like fantasy, I'd recommend checking it out. Fable is a fun one. Alright, number 6, Earthbound. Now, Earthbound is an absolute classic. I'm sure most of you know what it is. It's an old-school Nintendo game, originally called Mother 2 in Japan. It's the second entry in the Mother series, but the first one to get an actual US release. Earthbound is very fun. It's another old-school turn-based RPG, but one of the things that I think makes it better than a lot of old-school turn-based RPGs is the atmosphere. It's got a very sunny and upbeat atmosphere, but then when you get to the end of the game and you encounter Gygus and some stuff leading up to Gygus, it's got some really genuinely creepy shit that I absolutely love. Earthbound is a classic for a reason. It's fucking fantastic. It's got an interesting story, interesting characters, and I love the tonal shift that makes it really creepy towards the end, because Gygus is easily one of the most terrifying video game characters I've ever seen. Not to mention, if you look into the backstory of why the creator made Gygus the way he did, it's actually pretty horrifying. But I won't get into that here. Maybe that's another topic for another day. Plenty of people have done videos on it and can probably articulate it better than I can. But essentially, he saw some disturbing shit when he was young, and that stuck with him, so he created the character. Alright, number 5, Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is easily my favorite old-school turn-based JRPG. It's got beautiful artwork by Akira Toriyama, who also created Dragon Ball and also the Dragon Quest series, which I've never played, but I do intend to in the future. Chrono Trigger has beautiful artwork, beautiful music, and the PS1 version is the version I prefer because of the animated cutscenes that are fucking cool. I did a stream of Chrono Trigger a few years ago, and it was one of the most fun streams I've ever done. It was easily one of my favorite streams I've done. Great game, good characters, good humor, good art, good atmosphere, very fun RPG. Alright, number 4, we have South Park The Fractured But Whole and South Park The Stick of Truth. I tied them together because I honestly can't decide which of the two I like better, because there are aspects I like better about each of them. I think gameplay-wise, Fractured But Whole is probably a little bit better, but story-wise, there's elements I like in both, so it's really hard to pick. But effectively, these games were South Park games made by Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of the show, and fully voiced by them and developed by them. And it definitely fits right in with the show, with the humor and the way it's written. But the first game, Stick of Truth, is a fantasy game, whereas The Fractured But Whole is a superhero game. But in both cases, it's just the South Park kids playing a game of those things, which is one of the things I love about classic South Park, so of course I love it in this game. And these games aren't, like, old, they're fairly new. So I think it recaptures something that the older South Park had, and some of newer South Park maybe doesn't have as much. There's definitely standout episodes here and there that do, and I'm not disputing that new South Park is still really fucking good. It's just the newer stuff tends to focus more on social commentary, so this was a nice breath of fresh air to go back in and experience the same kind of feeling you'd get watching an episode, say, like Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. There's all sorts of references in South Park, Stick of Truth, and Fractured But Whole to the show that you're only going to get if you've watched the show extensively and are very familiar with it. I really like how obscure some of the references are. But not to mention, it's just great RPGs. They play really fun. For turn-based RPGs, they're some of the better ones, and I really like them quite a bit. I'm also a huge South Park fan, so there's also that. Alright, number 3, we have Undertale, which is a game I literally just reviewed a couple weeks ago, and I fucking love this game. This is a game that came out back in 2015, so I'm late to the party on it, as I said in my review. But I recently played it this year, and God is it a good game. Has a terrible fan base, mind you, but there are some good parts of the fan base that I think get overshadowed by the memes and toxicity that come with certain parts of it. And I think some of the creative side of the fan base are actually really cool. But enough about the fan base, let's talk about the actual game. I did do a whole review of it, so if you want to know my thoughts more in depth on it, look at that. So Undertale was a game made by a very small team, mostly one guy, Toby Fox, in RPG Maker, which is a game-making program that is fairly simplistic, but apparently you can do a lot with it given the way Undertale turned out. But Undertale is a game that is fairly short compared to some other games, but boy does it have a lot of content for a relatively short game. There's so much replayability because there's so many different little secret things, there's different little intricate things you can do if you have different reactions with different characters. For instance, there's technically considered to be 3 main endings. There's the pacifist, neutral, and genocide ending, right? But the neutral ending has like 30 different versions or so. And it depends on how many people you've killed, who you've killed, and different things like that. There's also different little small things that will be in each of the endings depending on the different things you've said and done with the characters earlier on in the game. There's some dialogue that's fairly innocuous that later becomes something that can be brought up in the pacifist ending that wasn't something that I would think would be something the game remembers. But the game remembers a lot of things, and that also gives it more replayability, because it will remember your previous runs. If you've done a genocide playthrough, it's going to remember that, and it's going to remind you that it remembers that by making lots of little differences and changing the atmosphere quite a bit. The game also has very different encounters depending on if you're doing, like, pacifist or genocide. On top of that, there's different bosses that you encounter on all 3 runs, so I think that it's definitely worth going back and playing through different versions. But I also want to see all the different variations of the neutral ending, so that just encourages me to go back and make different choices each time. Undertale is ostensibly another turn-based RPG, but it's unique because it also combines it with a bullet hell, so you're controlling a little heart and dodging all of the different projectiles that your enemies throw at you. Undertale was also very heavily inspired by a lot of older RPGs, particularly Earthbound is one of the most noteworthy because Toby Fox had previously worked on an Earthbound Halloween hack, which he actually brought a song over from that, Megalovania, and converted it into an Undertale song. And I'm sure you've probably heard Megalovania because it was one of the things that was memed quite a bit, but it's a good song. It's not the best song in the game, but it's definitely top 3 for me. But that's another thing about the game, is it has a phenomenal soundtrack, one that I went out of my way to purchase because of how fucking much I loved it. But it's also a very unique RPG in that it kind of is a subversion of what you expect an RPG to do. Because it doesn't encourage you to kill and level up. It wants you to be, like, peaceful and not do that, but you can kill and level up. It's a very interesting subversion of expectations with that, and I think they do it really well. Not to mention it has great characters, a great story, and a great sense of humor. And the graphics have a retro feel, because it's definitely going more for that SNES 16-bit era look, but they're very charming, and I love the graphics. I do kind of like the retro aesthetic that it has, and I do like a lot of modern games that have that. Though I do think that's been a motif that's been done to death recently, because there's a lot of games like that. But that said, Undertale does it really well. This was a game I originally avoided because I was turned off by certain elements of the fanbase, and then I didn't think much of the actual game. And then I actually tried the game because my friend convinced me to, and it's one of my favorite games now. I absolutely love it, I've been obsessed with it, and I've been playing the shit out of it ever since I played it. There's also a hard mode, which has some unique stuff too. It's pretty difficult too. So overall, it's definitely worth playing and going back to time and time again because there's so many different little things that give it replayability. There's also something called fun value, which will give you certain random events depending on what your fun value is randomly set at. But enough of me gushing about this game. I could go on for hours. I've been having a great time with it, but let's move on to number 2. Alright, at number 2 we have the Elder Scrolls, specifically Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim, because those are the 3 I've played. I love each of them for different reasons, so it's really hard to pick between the 3. I would say atmosphere-wise, Morrowind is my favorite. I also really like how it doesn't hold your hand. It wants you to figure shit out for yourself. That's one thing I really love about Morrowind. But with Oblivion, it has a certain wackiness to it that's not in the other 2, and that gives it a certain charm too. I also think Oblivion has some of the more interesting faction side quests. For instance, I think Oblivion's Dark Brotherhood is way more interesting than Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood. Not to say that I don't like Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood, because I do. I like them both quite a bit. Also, Oblivion has a way cooler Thieves Guild. But I do like Skyrim's companions, I think, more than the Fighters Guild, because the companions you can turn into a werewolf. You can also turn into a werewolf in the Game of the Year edition of Morrowind, but that's a lot more difficult to do, whereas you can do it, like, right from the beginning of the game in Skyrim. Skyrim is also the only one I've actually beat all the way through. That's not to say I haven't gotten far in the other 2, especially Oblivion. I haven't gotten that far in Morrowind, to be fair. I've never even gotten the Dwemer puzzle box. But I was close to it on a stream, and then that console gave out, so now I gotta get there again on my new save, but hopefully it doesn't take too long. Actually, no, I got to it on my new save, didn't I? I just need to load it up and actually continue the stream at some point. But Elder Scrolls is also by Bethesda, who also did the Fallout games that I've played anyway. They didn't do all of them, and I don't know if they did all the Elder Scrolls either. I think they did, but I'm not sure. But they did all the ones I'm referencing anyway. But Elder Scrolls is my favorite fantasy game series of all time. I absolutely love it. It's an RPG that's not like turn-based or anything. You just kind of go around and do what you want. There's not really a wrong way to play it. Now, you're not going to beat it unless you do certain things, and there's definitely a way to play Morrowind better than not, because there are some things that are required to do that you wouldn't know to do otherwise, because again, Morrowind does not hold your hand at all. But it's got a very interesting universe, pretty fun characters. Each one has different characters because they're set in different eras. And great locations. I love the world of Elder Scrolls. Tamriel is one of my favorite fictional places. And I'm hoping the Elder Scrolls 6 is good too, but we'll have to see how that turns out when it eventually does come out. Alright, number 1, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is also one of my absolute favorite games of all time, and it is my favorite RPG of all time. It's a game where you get to be either light side or dark side, and you start out working for the Republic, you work your way up and become a Jedi, and then you can basically be a complete and total piece of shit, and be like total dark side, or you can be a goody-goody, be total light side, or you can be a gray Jedi, which is kind of in the middle. There's only really 2 endings to Knights of the Old Republic. There's the light side ending and the dark side ending. There are maybe a few different aspects that are different depending on some choices you make towards the end. But there are romance aspects in Knights of the Old Republic. There are in the second game as well, and the second game's pretty fun too, but in all honesty, the second game was released kind of unfinished because it was really rushed, so the second game will constantly crash, has kind of an anticlimactic ending. I have some problems with the second game's ending. But the second game does have a lot of cool features that aren't in the first, so it's also still really fun. But the first one's definitely the better of the two. It's got more interesting characters, it's got more interesting allies and enemies, and it's got more interesting planets, I think, for the most part. Though I do like the second game has more. But I have done playthroughs of Knights of the Old Republic 1. Haven't completed it, but I've played a good chunk of it on the stream. I do need to continue that at some point. It's also not really turn-based, but it does have a very unique combat system where it has like an auto combat where it will automatically attack unless you do special attacks, which I think is how World of Warcraft works, but I don't remember because I haven't played a ton of World of Warcraft. But I have played a little bit of it back in the day. But Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is not only my favorite RPG and one of my top 10 favorite games of all time, but it's also my favorite entry in the Star Wars franchise. It was the thing that actually introduced Mandalorians as a concept. That's one of the things I really liked about it, and that's one of the reasons I gushed so much over The Mandalorian when it came out, because I love Mandalorians as a concept. Yes, I know Boba Fett was in, Empire Strikes Back, but the concept of actual Mandalorians weren't fully established until Knights of the Old Republic, when they introduced us to Mandalorians and actually called them that, and also told us about the Mandalorian Wars, introduced us to one of my all-time favorite Star Wars characters, Canderous Ordo. I fanboy over that character so much because he's so fucking cool. There's also a pretty good tie-in novel that ties together Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, and also ties them both to the Old Republic. I'm not as big of a fan of the Old Republic because I'm not as big on MMOs as I am single-player RPGs, so I haven't played as much of that. But yeah, Knights of the Old Republic is absolutely fucking fantastic. There's a nice twist at the midway point of the game, actually more the 2/3 mark. But I'm not going to spoil it here, but it's one of my favorite things because when it happened to me as a kid, I was so happy when I got to the twist. Man, I love Knights of the Old Republic. Anyway, that's my top 10 RPGs of all time. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye, and I hope you've enjoyed it. You have yourself a good one, and toodles.
What a grand adventure this has been. God bless us, everyone.
I'm gonna fucking die here, Jack!